Hello plant lovers and welcome to my channel, and this week's glorious orchid is this little fellow, Dendrobium aphyllum. I think that's how you pronounce it. Forgive me if I'm wrong. What a glorious flower that is. Now unfortunately it is my sad duty to inform you that the flowers do not last long, maybe only a week. However, the older the plant gets, the more flowers you get, so it pays off in that regard. But anyway, this is the Dendrobium aphyllum. Okay, let's get to basics. I, plant lovers, am in Melbourne, which I will show you here, which is southeast Australia, the equivalent roughly to a zone 10 in the USA. And if the wind's in the right direction, certain parts of southeast England. We have fairly cold and damp winters, which don't freeze, and we have mixed summers, which can be exceedingly hot, warm, and wet. A mixed bag of everything. Now this orchid is well, it's quite unusual because it's got a very wide range from southern China through the Himalayas down through Southeast Asia all the way to Queensland in Australia. It grows in a variety of conditions from fairly low altitudes to very high altitudes, which means it can take a multitude of temperature types. As a species then, it is described, perhaps not that helpfully, as a cool to hot growing orchid, which is kind of every climatic condition that orchids can grow in. So you kind of have to find your own way. Here in Melbourne, I have this outside all year and it seems to be fine, and it has flowered for me. The trick is, as with most dendrobiums, they are epiphytic and they really do cling in sort of inopportune spaces. So when they do get wet, when they do get rained upon, the water runs past them very quickly, they absorb what they need very quickly, and then they are dry very quickly. So you need to try and replicate those conditions with your watering. And as with most dendrobiums, it likes a dry winter spell. And this is very difficult because for me, you think I am denying my children their sustenance, but in fact it's not the case. Do keep it dry, not bone dry. So I don't not water them at all, but I try to go against nature, my own nature, and keep it as dry as possible, and maybe just give it a little bit of a dribble once a month. And as with most dendrobiums, it then does like winter sunlight. So if you can find a spot where it gets winter sun, that's great in the morning. And then for the rest of the year, I would give it dappled sunlight just to protect it. Not that many orchids like direct sun. So even though it comes from a wide variety of locations, that seems to be what's worked for me. So as you can see as well, it is perhaps not the most attractive looking plant. The canes are deciduous, as you can see. This one is just starting to put out its new growth, which I'll do a close-up and show you. And they obviously do have leaves, which look very much like dendrobiums. But I haven't had this for a hugely long time yet, but it does spend a lot of its time naked. I bought this in midwinter as a division, and it literally was naked sticks. So I was amazed that it's flowered, and I'm kind of curious to see its growth patterns. There are various new shoots coming up here, so I'm curious to see how the canes form, how often they form, but I imagine, like with most dendrobiums, most of the growth is in early to late spring. In this case, it's actually early summer, and that's when you need to start ramping up your water and fertilizer. So really, the minute in this case that you see the flower buds forming is when you want to start feeding it and watering it. Not crazily, but just ramping it up. And as the weather gets warmer, increase the amount of water and fertilizer you're giving it. As you can see, plant lovers, once again, I am a terracotta pot kind of guy, but it doesn't matter, whatever works for you. I like terracotta because it evaporates the water very quickly. They look better, I think, as well. And that evaporation enables the roots to remain relatively dry and not soggy, and also to create a little bit of a humidity crib around the orchid as the water evaporates and giving a little bit of humidity. The flowers are incredibly delicate. They're very papery lemon and then a very papery lilac around the outside, but they're stunning. And if you get close, there is a fragrance, which I would say was almost a lemony, not a strong lemony, but a light lemony fragrance. Subtle and beautiful, and you really have to get your nose in. Now these orchids do have the capacity to become huge specimens, and that's kind of the aim. So the longer that the canes become, each one of them will be covered in flowers, and you'll end up with a waterfall, a cascade of blooms. So that's what we're hoping for. This was a division, as I said, so these canes were already mature. As with most dendrobiums, I think, though, you'd probably have to wait a couple of years if you had a seedling or a young plant before the cane was mature enough for it to start flowering. I haven't had this long enough to find out for myself, but generally Dendrobiums will flower on a mature cane from the previous year's growth. And then those canes can survive for years and they can keep producing flowers for years. So don't cut them off. Even though in this case, as you can see, they might look dead, they're in fact not. It is just deciduous and has dropped its leaves. There we are, plant lovers. I think we've covered everything for Dendrobium aphyllum. It's a species Dendrobium, which means it is as it's found in the wild. It comes from many places in the world, so there is a variety of locations, which means you should have a good chance of being able to grow it successfully kind of wherever you are. For me, this is living outside all year, under protection so it doesn't get too wet, and it gets morning sun and then filtered light. If you had it indoors, you'd want to try and replicate that. So stronger light in winter, dappled light in summer, easing off with the watering in winter, and if it is indoors, which can be quite dry, you might need to just be misting it much more often than you would if it was outdoors, because particularly in a heated environment, the air can get very dry. With this, I'm looking forward to seeing what these new growths look like, how big they get, and how many canes I can get this year. There we are, plant lovers. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for liking, if indeed you did. Of course, you might not. That's okay. Feel free to ask a question. I am but an amateur struggling my way through the world of orchid growing, finding out as I go what works for me and what doesn't in this environment. But I'm really thrilled with this. It's a real little beauty. Perhaps not that practical because the flowers don't last that long, but it nonetheless is great. From Dendrobium aphyllum and myself, thank you for watching, and I will see you next week, hopefully with something equally as interesting.